Cuando tengamos que poner más pasión y más cariño para hacer cada vez más grande a Chile y cada vez más justa la vida en nuestra patria.
Bueno, Iden, me gusta partir la conversación con la sala de operaciones de Synco al fondo, a tu espalda, porque poca gente sabe del proyecto Synco desarrollado por la Unidad Popular entre el 71 y el 73, y en tu libro Revolucionarios Cibernéticos tú asocias el proyecto Synco al sueño utópico de la vía chilena al socialismo.
Project Synco, Proyecto Synco, or Project Cybersyn in English, was a project that was directly related to the political program of the Popular Unity government. So in the Popular Unity framework, we were going to see revolutionary change. We were going to see dramatic changes to economic and social relations in Chile. But these changes were going to occur within Chile's existing legal and constitutional framework. So they were to occur peacefully. They were to respect existing civil liberties, such as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. As a political project, the Popular Unity government wanted to decrease inequality, socioeconomic inequality between different sectors of Chilean society. It wanted to redistribute wealth. There were initiatives such as an agrarian reform and programs such as a national milk plan where Chilean children would each get a certain quantity of powdered milk every day. And also there was an initiative to bring the most important industries in Chile under state control so that they could be run by the government. This was a very difficult process, as the government found when it began this initiative. Although the government had a list of industries that it wanted to bring under state control, things didn't always go as planned. Sometimes workers took control of their factories and took factories that had not been on the original list for bringing into the state sector. And also the government did not have experience running an economy on this scale, right? It was a tremendously complex endeavor. And so the government organization that was charged with running the nationalization effort was known as Corfo. And within Corfo, the person who was charged with running the technical aspects of the nationalization process was a young engineer named Fernando Flores. And Fernando Flores thought that perhaps cybernetic thinking, which in its most general form, cybernetics is the study of communication and control. So perhaps cybernetic thinking and perhaps new technologies, such as computer technologies, could help the government manage this tricky and complex nationalization endeavor. And so Flores reached out to a cybernetician in the field of management cybernetics named Stafford Beer to see if they might collaborate to create something. And the result was an information system known as Project Cybersyn or Proyecto Synco. In its most basic terms, it consisted of 4 components. There was a telex network that ran the length of the country to deliver telex messages, which we can think of as similar to fax messages because they were text-based. There was an initiative to build a customized suite of software that would use statistical prediction methods to figure out what crises might emerge in Chilean factories and in Chilean production so that the government could address them. And there was also a simulator, an economic simulator that policymakers in theory could use to test out their ideas before implementation. And then also there was this operations room, which you see behind me, which was this very futuristic looking command space where government policymakers or workers could come together to think about what is going on in the economy and to make decisions that would help the economy thrive into the future.
Mencionaste al cibernetista inglés Stafford Beer,
Yes.
que es un personaje muy protagónico y tal vez el más fascinante de la historia de Synco, Alguien por ahí lo describió como una mezcla de Orson Welles y Sócrates. Algunos lo consideraban un charlatán, otros un genio. Me gustaría que nos hablara un poco de él y por qué alguien como él, que era una persona bastante exitosa en Inglaterra, tuvo interés en venir e involucrarse en este proyecto en Chile.
His charisma, I would say, drew some people to him, and it also caused some people to be distrusting of him. Over the course of his life, he wrote 10 books on cybernetics, as well as a number of articles, including an article that was published in the journal Nature, which is one of the most respected scientific publications in the world. But apart from being his cybernetic work, he was a poet. He was an artist. And so something that separates his work in management cybernetics than, say, some of his contemporaries might publish scientific papers that were filled with equations, and his might have drawings or might have excerpts from his own poetry. So he was a very, I would say, unorthodox figure within the operations research community and also within the cybernetics community. Stafford Beer is known for his work in a particular area of cybernetics, which is known as management cybernetics. And sometimes you might even hear him referred to as the father of management cybernetics. So he's a person who took cybernetic ideas into the study of how you might manage a firm or an industry. By the time he was contacted about coming to Chile, he was running his own consulting firm called Sigma. And he was contacted by Fernando Flores, the young Chilean engineer who I had mentioned, who was working in Corfo. And in essence, Flores wrote him a letter and said, "This is what's going on in Chile. I've read your work. Would you consider sending one of your consultants to Chile to help us think through this process?" And to understand Beer's reaction to this, you need to understand some aspects of Beer's work. So over the course of Beer's lifetime, but in particular in this moment, he is thinking of ways to control and predict the behavior of exceedingly complex systems. So these are systems that you can't know all of the intricacies of the relationships, you can't know what is going on inside the black box, but yet we want to be able to say something about their behavior. Another example of an exceedingly complex system is a national economy, right? So this invitation is fitting right into the kinds of systems that Beer is interested in studying. The other thing you need to know is that Beer had, for his day, while he was not the only one to hold this view, he was in a minority, he thought computers were currently being used in ways that were completely incorrect. Computers at this time were these large mainframe computers, and they were mostly being used as giant calculating machines. And that's all well and good, but Beer believed that computers should be used to drive action, right? They should process information in ways that we can operationalize it so that we can do things in the world. So Beer is interested in action, right? How we use information to action. And then the last part is he's been thinking during this time period about the relationship of cybernetics and politics and kind of similarities between cybernetics and social systems, right, and organizations. And one of the recurrent themes in his work is how do you find a balance between top-down control so that, so that a system can survive, right? But also, participation from the bottom up so that we don't have oppression, right? So that we don't have a loss of individual liberty, which is, how do you bring about a dramatic change in social and economic relationships within the existing legal framework? Right? How do you maintain freedom of the press and freedom of speech, while also expanding the reach of the state through a nationalization effort, right? So it is precisely this kind of balance. And so to go back to Beer, when he received this letter from Fernando Flores, imagine that your scientific work, your intellectual work, are in the domains that I just outlined. And then someone writes to you. And in essence, they're offering you an opportunity to apply your ideas in the context of an entire nation, right? In essence, they're giving you a country to which you can experiment or apply or develop or explore these ideas that you have been developing. And so for Beer, there was no question. He wasn't going to send anyone else. He wanted to go himself.
¿Y qué función cumplió Salvador Allende en toda esta historia? O sea, ¿tuvo alguna participación en el desarrollo del proyecto? ¿Qué rol le atribuía a Synco en la puesta en marcha de la vía chilena al socialismo?
Yeah, so one of the, I would say, more popular stories to come out of the Proyecto Synco history, or Project Cybersyn history, is a story of when Stafford Beer and Salvador Allende met for the first time. What Allende thought of Stafford Beer, we don't know. But what we do know is that the meeting left a lasting impression on Stafford Beer. And to understand that, you need to recognize that Stafford Beer's cybernetics, his ideas are not easy to understand on a first pass. So control for most people, you might think of as top-down domination. But for Beer, control was about finding stability through adaptation. So how do you create mechanisms so that complex systems can adapt to their environment, can reach their point of stability, and be able to survive? So some terms even had, not common definitions. But as he tells the story, he was so impressed with how Salvador Allende understood his cybernetic ideas, in particular, the explanation of a core concept in Beer's writings called the viable systems model, which is a 5-tier system that seems like a hierarchy, but actually is much more complicated than that, right? It's not just top down, it's interconnected, right? It's about finding stability. And he was so impressed with how Allende immediately grasped this model, which Beer was explaining in terms of the human neurosystem. And he said, since Allende had trained as a doctor, he thought that perhaps that helped the president understand right away what was going on.
While that model of the viable systems in your mind, let me tell you what happened when I first explained it to President Allende himself. Allende was a doctor, a medical doctor, as you may know. And therefore, it was very easy to explain the model to him in terms of neurocybernetics as the way of controlling the body. And then I went into the business of controlling the state. And so I said to him, let us suppose that these elements of the state are the big departments of state, like the foreign affairs and the economy and home affairs, so on. And then we'll have those, and the following things will happen, and then we must have a system 2, and I built it up on a piece of paper lying on the table between us. Then a system 3 and a system 4, and I got that far. And then I got to system 5, and I drew a big histrionic breath. And I said, I was going to say, this compañero presidente is you. Before I could say it, he suddenly smiled very broadly, and he said, System 5, at last, the people.
La relación entre política y cibernética en el caso chileno es bien particular, por los recursos disponibles, por las soluciones propuestas, por el contexto político. Y interesante si tú puedes situar el caso chileno en el panorama global de la cibernética, teniendo como referencia Estados Unidos, Inglaterra y la Unión Soviética, que evidentemente funcionan a otra escala y con otro nivel de complejidad.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, cybernetics has a particular history, but, throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the term itself took on different meanings in different parts of the world. So in the United States context, you see an interest in cybernetics, in this idea of feedback and control, sometimes the use of computer systems in addressing these questions. You see it entering Cold War strategizing. You see it entering urban planning, right? You see these ideas entering understandings of ecology and natural systems and the depletion of natural resources, right? So these ideas of, how do we understand complex systems and manage them, right? Help them find their stability point. These ideas go everywhere. Within the Soviet Union, cybernetics at first had kind of a negative political connotation. For example, cybernetics was often associated with, the study of or the creation of giant brains, right? We're studying the brain through computers, we have giant brains. And so, the concern was, this is coming out of the United States. These are giant brains. Like, what kind of brains are these, right? Are these capitalist brains? That's not what we want to bring into the Soviet Union. So there was this veneer of distrust because of the Cold War context. But bit by bit, there is this shift, and cybernetics becomes a way, as part of a shift in general, to think about how you might quantify the social, right? And by quantifying the social, you're making it more scientific. And one of the subfields that emerges through those efforts is a field known as economic cybernetics, which is an effort on the part of the Soviet government to figure out how to use, these ideas of communication, control, computation to run a command economy. And indeed, like Chile, the Soviet Union has a plan to create a computer system to run a planned economy. But it's very different from the Chilean system in the sense that the Soviets envisioned having different tiers of computers. The first tier would have, thousands and thousands of computers. The second tier would have, hundreds of computers, and they would all link to one computer in Moscow. In Chile, we see something very different. Like the United States and like the Soviet Union, Chile is interested in how do we understand and predict the behavior of an exceedingly complex system, right? And how do we use statistical tools in order to do that? But it's coming out of a context of democratic socialism. And in this context of democratic socialism, the assumptions are different. So in this context, computers will not, and indeed cannot, lead to greater unemployment, right? We don't want to have people losing their jobs, right? We want to make sure that workers, in fact, that their knowledge is respected and built into the system, and that there are possibilities for worker participation even within the system, right? So in terms of the goals of how the technology will work, it's different. And then the other big difference we see concerns the technological resources that Chile had during this time period. So while the Soviet Union was planning to have, thousands and thousands of computers, beneath 100, 200 computers, beneath a single computer, in 1970, Chile had 50 computers in the entire nation, right? A small subset of those were owned by the government. And of that small subset, the government said, at least initially, you can have access to one computer to build this project.
Synco, o sea, el proyecto Synco como una red computacional para gestionar la economía nunca se completó, pero lo que había fue gran ayuda para sortear momentos muy críticos de la unidad popular. Estoy pensando específicamente en el paro de octubre de 1972.
And this really was a turning point in the history of the popular unity government. So previously, the government had been on the offense, right? It was, trying to bring its socialist program into being. Following the Paro de Octubre, this was a demonstration of class power by the opposition that tried to set the stages for a coup and thus an early end to the Allende government. And so what began, with several hundred truck drivers striking, quickly grew to several thousand, tens of thousands of truck drivers striking, blocking the streets, preventing distribution. And obviously, the truck drivers are not acting on their own. There's a lot of coordination that is involved in these efforts. And when you look at the history of the Paro de Octubre, the resolution of the strike is often credited to Allende bringing members of the military into the cabinet, as well as to the creativity of people who are working in Chile's industrial belts on the ground, who are figuring out ways to maintain production and ways to maintain distribution. But a lesser known facet of that story has to do with Project Cybersyn. And so while Cybersyn had these components, the telex network, the software, the simulator, and the operations room, the telex network that was being built gave the government a new communications backbone that they could use to coordinate, the vertical of what was taking place in government to the horizontal, like what was unfurling in the industrial belts, to find out what roads were open, to find out, what trucks were available, and not only to coordinate, these messages and send these messages, but to have a record, right? So you have a printed record of, okay, this truck went out, we can see that here. And so, having that kind of information capability to coordinate, communication and also have a record also played a part in the government's ability to respond to the October strike.
Si uno piensa en Synco, o la realidad de Synco, fue que reunió o convocó gente de profesiones distintas, imaginó esa sala de operaciones futurista que tiene a tu espalda, y uno puede decir que en el fondo puso a trabajar en conjunto a saberes o prácticas muy distintas que iban desde la ciencia más dura hasta el diseño. Entonces, a mí me parece que Synco no es solo historia de la tecnología. Synco también forma parte de la dimensión cultural de la Unidad Popular. No sé si te hace sentido esa afirmación.
Yes. So I agree. It certainly is a product of a cultural moment, but I would say also contributed in different ways to that cultural moment. And one of the ways that we can see this is in an area that you mentioned, which is design. So the popular unity period, as we're continuing to learn, was a very important moment in the history of Chilean design, and I would say in the history of design, period. Under the popular unity, there were a number of efforts to look at the politics of design, right? In fact, this is when Chile has its first state-sponsored industrial design group, which is a group that is interested not only in the form and function of objects, but how it can relate, how the form and function of these objects can relate to political realities and political possibilities. So whether it's thinking about new designs for furniture that are durable, less expensive and accessible, or even the design of a spoon to administer the rations of powdered milk that Chilean children were now receiving as part of the National Milk Plan, or the design of new agricultural machinery that was less expensive, but now could be made available to broader swaths of the population, or a cybernetics operations room, like what is behind me, where thinking about design in intentional ways. You can see that the chairs behind me are arranged in a circle and that there is an odd number of chairs. And that is so that you would not have a tie for voting, and that's so all people would enter the room as equals, right? And moreover, that there's no table in this room, because it was thought that if you had a table, people would just spend all the time, sorting papers, reading papers, and they wouldn't listen to each other. So removing the table was a very thoughtful design decision to encourage conversation. So we see these moments about, political projects, envisioning political possibilities, and how that shaped design activities and the creation of, very real and mundane objects, such as a spoon, to very fantastical spaces, such as a cybernetics operations room.